Why is it that, as a society, we can look at someone struggling to afford groceries or facing chronic eviction and just treat them with this profound, almost instinctive suspicion?
Right. We instantly analyze their choices.
Exactly. We wonder if they're just lazy. We often frame their everyday poverty as a personal moral failure.
But then a disaster
Yeah,
strikes.
the very second a Category 5 hurricane wipes out their entire town or an earthquake shatters their community, we experience a total behavioral 180.
It's a complete flip.
Suddenly, those exact same people we were just judging for needing food stamps, we are rushing to give them our money, our time, and our unconditional empathy.
We'll even risk our own physical safety to pull them out of the wreckage.
Right. It is one of the most glaring, uncomfortable contradictions in human behavior.
And the shift is so instantaneous, it almost gives you whiplash.
You know, it reminds me of how we look at a medical diagnosis. Like with medicine, we expect precision.
Sure.
If you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an x-ray, and there's a bright, jagged white line.
Clear as day.
The doctor points to it and says, there is the problem. It's clean. It's binary.
Yeah, but human psychology doesn't work like that.
No, not at all. When you step into the world of altruism and social welfare, that x-ray machine is completely broken. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely ready, just full of biases and contradictions.
Which is deeply unsettling for people, honestly. Because we like our morality to be as clean as that x-ray.
We really do.
We want to believe our compassion is this fixed, universal trait. But the data shows it is incredibly conditional.
And exploring those exact conditions is our mission today. So whether you are commuting, prepping for a meeting, or you're just intensely curious about the weird, hidden gears turning inside the human mind, welcome to Today in the Hypothesis.
We have a massive stack of source material to get through today.
We really do. We are unpacking a highly expansive research paper by independent researcher Victor H. Sertouche, synthesized by Gemini.
It's titled The Architecture of Compassion.
Right, the architecture of compassion. Evolutionary, cultural, and sociological dimensions of the altruism threshold.
It is a remarkable synthesis, I have to say.
What makes it so unique?
Well, what this paper does is take fields that usually operate in complete isolation. So evolutionary biology, disaster sociology, cognitive psychology.
Behavioral economics, too, right?
Yes, and even 19th century history. And it threads them all together to explain this exact paradox.
Yeah.
It attempts to answer why our empathy basically has an on and off switch.
And the central concept they use to explain this is something called the small mind threshold.
Now, for you listening, we should clarify that isn't an insult.
Yeah, we aren't calling anyone small-minded here.
Right, it's a theoretical framework. The small mind threshold is basically an automatic subconscious psychological safeguard.
Like a boundary line.
Exactly. It's a line drawn in our brains that forces us to view everyday chronic requests for help as something dangerous, as something that enables laziness.
It's like an evolutionary firewall.
That's a great way to put it. But the fascinating part of the hypothesis is what happens during an undeniable tragedy.
Some natural disaster.
Yes. A massive natural disaster acts as a cognitive skeleton key.
A cognitive skeleton key. I love that framing.
It is the one thing that can bypass this firewall, deactivate our ingrained suspicions, and liberate this profound, innate human compassion that is otherwise just locked away.
Because it implies there's a lock we have to pick. And to understand why that lock exists in the first place, we apparently have to rewind the clock way, way back.
Back to the Pleistocene era.
Yeah, we are talking about ancient cavemen, Pleistocene-era survival, and the actual biological hardware of helping. So let's kick this off. Why did human beings evolve to be so inherently suspicious of someone asking for a handout?
Well, to understand the biological hardware, you have to picture the ancestral environment. Early humans, roaming the savanna back then, lived in very small face-to-face groups.
Right.
Their entire survival depended on a system called reciprocal altruism.
How did that work day to day?
Back then, highly nutritious resources, specifically meat from large game, were incredibly difficult and dangerous to acquire.
High risk, high reward.
Exactly. You could hunt for an entire week and come back totally empty-handed. Or you could bring down an animal so massive you couldn't possibly eat it all yourself before it spoiled.
Because there's no refrigeration.
Right, no freezers on the savannah.
So you have a massive caloric surplus today, but you might literally starve next week.
Precisely the dilemma. And the evolutionary solution was sharing. If I make a huge kill today, I give you a significant portion of my meat.
But there's a catch, right?
A huge one. That gift comes with an unspoken ironclad guarantee. When I go a week without a kill and you bring down an animal, you are going to share with me.
It functioned as biological insurance.
It was life or death. So cooperation wasn't just about being a nice neighbor. It was a mathematical necessity for caloric survival.
But that exact system of reciprocal altruism introduced a massive existential vulnerability into the human group, didn't it?
It did. The threat of the free ride.
A cheater.
Yes. What happens if someone in your group continually sits by the fire, eats the meat you risk your life to hunt, but never actually goes out to hunt themselves?
Or they do make a kill, but they hide it and refuse to share.
Exactly. In a modern office, a free rider just means you have to do extra work on a PowerPoint presentation.
Right. It's annoying, but you'll live.
But in the Pleistocene, that free rider is physically consuming the calories you need to keep your own children alive.
So a free rider in that environment is a fatal threat.
Enabling someone's laziness wasn't a social faux pas. It would literally end your genetic lineage.
Oh.
Because the stakes were so absolute, the human brain had to evolve a highly specialized defense mechanism to prevent being suckered.
And the paper calls this the deservingness heuristic, right?
Yes, evolutionary psychologists call it a deservingness heuristic.
Okay, let's break that phrase down for everyone listening. A heuristic is basically just a mental shortcut, right?
Yeah, rule of thumb.
A way for the brain to make a snap judgment without having to do a ton of deep analytical math.
That's right. The brain is an energy hog, so it uses heuristics to save time and calories.
So what does this specific one do?
This specific deservingness heuristic evolved as a rapid threat detection algorithm. Its sole purpose is to instantly differentiate between two scenarios when someone asks for food.
Scenario A and Scenario B.
Right. Scenario A, did my neighbor fail to get meat today because of genuine bad luck? Like maybe the herd migrated early or they twisted an ankle.
Well, makes sense. And Scenario B.
Scenario B, are they empty-handed because they are fundamentally lazy and trying to exploit my labor?
And if the brain detects Scenario A, the bad luck, it opens the vault. We share.
Yes. But if it detects Scenario B, the laziness, the firewall goes up and we cut them off to protect our own survival.
And the crazy part is that biological algorithm is still running in the background of every single human brain today.
It absolutely is.
Which brings us to what the paper calls the modern-day misfire. Because we aren't huddled around a campfire splitting a woolly mammoth anymore.
No, we live in a totally different world.
We are living in a society of over 330 million people, governed by complex, multi-trillion-dollar macroeconomic welfare systems, tax brackets, housing policies.
And our hardware hasn't caught up. Evolution is incredibly slow.
So what happens when we try to process modern problems?
Well, when a modern citizen is asked to evaluate a massive, complex social welfare policy, say, expanding the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, their brain doesn't process it as a macroeconomic structural issue.
It doesn't.
No. The brain unconsciously processes it as if it were a small-scale ancestral exchange of meat.
That is wild. It's like trying to run the latest artificial intelligence software on a computer built in 1995.
It's a complete mismatch of scale.
We are judging a massive socioeconomic policy based on a caveman's fear of a lazy roommate.
It is the ultimate scaling error.
Yeah.
We form these intense, visceral political opinions about welfare, not based on econometric data, but almost entirely on this ancient gut-level feeling of whether the recipient is perceived as making an effort or trying to cheat the system.
So how does this algorithm actually weigh the evidence? The paper talks about two different psychological models used to study this, right?
You have the older Karen framework and the newer NICER framework.
Let's look at the NICER model, because that one seems to hold the key to understanding this.
The NICER model is a comprehensive way to map out exactly what triggers that primitive deservingness heuristic.
What does it stand for?
The acronym stands for need, identity, control, effort, and reciprocity. Each of these acts like a toggle switch in the brain.
Okay, so 5 switches.
But the most crucial switches, the ones that carry the most weight when deciding if someone gets help, are control and effort.
Let's walk through those, because control seems to be the linchpin. That's the brain asking, how much agency did this person have over their own suffering?
Exactly. If the observer perceives the victim's situation as high control, meaning the observer believes the victim made bad choices, chose not to work hard enough, or mismanaged their money.
That triggers the laziness penalty.
Yes. The threat detection system flashes red, the small mind threshold stays slammed shut, and compassion is withheld.
Which perfectly explains the bias against chronic poverty. Because in a hyper-individualistic society, we are conditioned to view almost all everyday poverty as a high-control event.
Right. We assume people have total control over their economic destiny.
But look at what happens when a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. A hurricane is the ultimate low-control event.
It really is. No amount of personal responsibility, hard work, or bootstrapping can stop a 150-mile-per-hour wind from ripping the roof off your house.
So when a disaster strikes, the control criterion is overwhelmingly, undeniably satisfied in the victim's favor.
The hurricane is the Cognitus skeleton key. It bypasses the control switch entirely.
It signals to that ancient Pleistocene threat detector, hey, stand down. This isn't a free rider trying to steal our meat. This is genuine, undeniable bad luck.
It forces the threshold open, and the other toggle switches in the nicer model identity and effort play significant supporting roles once that threshold opens.
Right, because identity determines whether we see the person as part of our in-group.
Yeah. If they share our nationality, our community, or even just a shared sense of humanity forged by the disaster, the threshold to help them lowers significantly.
And effort acts as the final confirmation, right?
Exactly. If a victim is seen actively trying to improve their situation during the crisis, think of the classic news footage of a homeowner frantically filling sandbags before the floodwaters rise.
That completely negates the evolutionary perception of laziness.
The brain sees them expending calories, expending effort, and it fully authorizes the observer to provide aid without any lingering fear of being exploited.
I want to touch on something really fascinating from the source material here, because this isn't just an abstract psychological debate.
No, it's very physical.
This calculation is physically coursing through our veins. There is actual quantifiable endocrinology hormones driving this response.
The biology of compassion is remarkable. It proves how deeply embedded this is.
What happens chemically during a disaster?
Well, when extreme shared adversity strikes, the human body's biological stress response actually shifts. Normally, chronic stress pumps out cortisol, which makes us agitated and defensive.
Right, the fight or flight hormone.
But in a massive communal crisis, the body often activates what's called a tend and befriend response.
And what's driving that tend and befriend response?
It is heavily mediated by the hormone oxytocin.
Wait, oxytocin, isn't that the cuddle hormone?
Right. Well, we often think of oxytocin purely as the love or bonding hormone. In the context of a disaster, it physically drives us to seek affiliation.
So it changes our behavior towards strangers.
It suppresses the fear centers of the brain and promotes pro-social cooperative behavior to ensure mutual survival.
So our bodies literally drug us into cooperating when things get apocalyptic.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
That is incredible. And the text mentions other hormones play a role in setting our baseline thresholds too, like estrogen and testosterone.
Yeah, the paper notes that baseline endocrinological factors heavily influence the type of help we offer. Higher estrogen levels often correlate with a lower baseline threshold for helping.
Meaning what, practically?
A more generalized, everyday, care-oriented concern for the well-being of others, regardless of whether there's an emergency.
Okay. And what about testosterone?
Testosterone is frequently associated with the type of action we see when a massive disaster breaks the threshold.
Dramatic stuff.
Right. It correlates with courageous, high-risk, instrumental interventions. The person who grabs a rope and wades into toxic floodwaters to pull someone from a submerged car.
So that requires a testosterone-mediated suppression of personal fear to execute heroic helping.
Exactly.
So we have the evolutionary hardware, we have the Pleistocene threat detection algorithm, the nicer toggle switches, and the hormonal cocktails driving the whole machine.
The biological foundation.
But if evolution is the hardware, how does our brain actually execute this code in real time? Like, how do we intellectually justify slamming the door on someone in need on a Tuesday, but opening our wallets wide on a Friday after a tornado hits?
To figure that out, we have to look at the psychological software.
Let's do it.
And the foundational piece of psychological software running in the human mind is known as attribution theory.
Who came up with that?
This was primarily developed by psychologist Fritz Heider and later expanded by Bernard Wiener. Heider had this wonderful phrase he called human beings naive scientists.
Naive scientists. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means that humans have a profound, fundamental intolerance for chaos. We cannot stand the idea that things just happen randomly for no reason.
We need order.
We desperately need the world to make sense. So like a scientist, we are constantly, obsessively observing events and trying to deduce the hidden causes behind them. We're always asking, why did that happen?
We're always trying to attribute a cause, hence attribution theory.
Exactly. And Wiener expanded on this by identifying 3 specific dimensions that our brains use to rapidly classify causality. We run every event through a three-part checklist.
And those three parts are locus, stability, and controllability, right?
That's right.
Okay, I want to slow down and really walk through these for you listening, because this three-part checklist is the lens through which we judge every single person we meet.
It really is.
Let's do a hypothetical. Imagine you are walking down the street in a major city and you see someone sitting on the sidewalk who is clearly experiencing chronic homelessness and extreme poverty.
Okay.
How does the naive scientist in our brain apply locus, stability, and controllability to that stranger?
Let's run the diagnostic. The first dimension is locus. The brain asks, is the cause of this person's poverty internal to them or external to them?
And what does the brain usually decide?
Because of a well-documented cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error, the observer's brain defaults to an internal locus. It assumes the person is on the street because of their own internal flaws, their character, their intelligence, their choices.
So that's strike one. The brain says it's their own fault. What's next?
The second dimension is stability. The brain asks, is this situation permanent or is it just a temporary state?
And for chronic poverty?
Again, with chronic poverty, the brain tends to view it as stable. The assumption is they have always been this way and they will always be this way. It's a permanent trait.
Strike two. And the final dimension is our old friend, controllability.
Right. The brain asks, are the circumstances within this person's power to change?
And despite massive structural inequalities in the real world,
The observer's brain frequently concludes that the situation is highly controllable. The internal narrative becomes, they could get a job if they really tried. They just aren't trying.
so the naive scientist computes the data, internal, stable, controllable. When the brain finishes that specific calculation, what is the emotional output? I'm guessing it isn't a warm rush of empathy.
Far from it. The emotional output generated by that specific internal calculation is frustration, anger, or even moral disgust.
Wow.
This internal narrative, quietly but forcefully, paralyzes any altruistic impulse you might have had. It cements the belief that giving this person $1 wouldn't help them, it would just enable their moral failure.
The small mind threshold locks down tightly.
Yes. But then the script flips entirely. A massive tsunami hits the coast.
Okay, so the naive scientist in our brain looks at the news footage of thousands of displaced people, and it runs the exact same three-part diagnostic. What happens?
The calculation inverts completely.
Let's go through it. Locus.
The cause is undeniably external. The ocean did this, not the person.
Stability.
It is highly unstable. This is a freak event, a temporary disruption of their normal life.
Controllability.
It is absolutely uncontrollable. Nobody can fight a tidal wave.
External, unstable, uncontrollable.
When a victim's plight is processed through those dimensions, the emotional output changes completely. The frustration and disgust evaporate, replaced entirely by pity, empathy, and grace.
Because you aren't blaming them anymore.
Because the locus of causality is shifted away from the victim, you are suddenly freed from the evolutionary suspicion that you are enabling a free rider.
It's amazing how mechanical it is. But there is another piece of psychological software mentioned in the paper that feels even darker and honestly a bit terrifying once you realize it's operating inside your own head.
The just world fallacy.
Yeah, introduced by Melvin Lerner in the 1960s.
It is deeply unsettling because it reveals how much of our morality is actually just a defense mechanism.
How so?
Lerner theorized that human beings possess a fundamental, intrinsic psychological need to believe that the world is an orderly, fair, and just place.
We want things to make sense.
We desperately, on a primal level, need to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
Because the alternative to that belief is just pure existential dread.
The alternative is accepting reality, that we live in a universe governed by random chance, chaotic physics, and amoral forces.
Which is terrifying.
A universe where you could be a wonderful, hardworking person, do everything exactly right, and still have your life suddenly and violently destroyed by a stray bullet, a cancer diagnosis, or a freak accident.
Most human brains simply cannot function with that level of constant terror.
We can't. It would lead to psychological disintegration. So, to manage that profound existential anxiety, we develop a cognitive bias, the just world fallacy, to act as a shield.
So where does the problem come in?
The problem arises when we witness someone experiencing extreme, unfair suffering. When we see an innocent person destroyed, it threatens our shield. It proves the world isn't fair.
And if the world isn't fair to them, it might not be fair to me. My safety is an illusion.
Precisely. So, to protect our own sense of safety, we engage in victim blaming.
Subconsciously.
We subconsciously rationalize that the victim must have done something to deserve their fate. If we can find a flaw in the victim, we restore the illusion of a just world.
Like saying they got sick because they didn't eat right.
Or they got robbed because they walked in the wrong neighborhood. It is a way of telling ourselves, I eat right, I walk in good neighborhoods, therefore I am safe.
The paper details these laboratory experiments Melvin Lerner conducted in the 1960s to prove this, and the methodology is shocking. I mean that literally.
It's a classic, somewhat infamous psychological study.
Walk us through what Lerner actually did in that room, because it is wild.
Lerner brought participants into a lab and had them sit behind a one-way mirror. Their task was simply to observe a learning experiment.
Okay, simple enough.
On the other side of the glass was a learner who was actually an actor working for Lerner. The observer watched as the actor was supposedly given memory tasks.
And when they messed up.
Every time the actor made a mistake, the observer watched them receive what appeared to be a severe electrical shock.
The observer is just sitting there, watching a stranger get tortured for failing a memory test.
And crucially, the observers were made to feel completely powerless. They were told they could not intervene, they could not stop the shocks, and they couldn't help the victim in any way.
How did they react initially?
At first, as you would expect, the observers were highly distressed. They felt empathy. They were uncomfortable watching innocent suffering.
But the shocks kept coming, the suffering continued, and the injustice remained uncorrected. What happened to the observers then?
A fascinating and dark psychological shift occurred. As the observers realized they were utterly powerless to fix the unfairness, the cognitive dissonance became too much to bear.
Their just world shield was cracking.
To protect their own sanity, they eventually began to change their perception of the victim. The observers started to derogate the person getting shocked.
Wait, they started turning on the victim.
They did. They began to verbally attack the actor's character. They would say things like, well, they aren't very smart, are they?
You're kidding.
Or, they're really not trying hard enough on these memory tests. Or, they must have known what they were signing up for.
That is bone-chilling. They chose to invent a reality where the victim was fundamentally flawed, just to avoid the terrifying truth that a perfectly innocent person was being hurt for no reason.
It was easier to believe the victim was bad than to accept the reality of random, unfair abuse.
Wow.
It proved that victim blaming isn't necessarily driven by pure malice or evil. It's a desperate, subconscious, psychological coping mechanism. We blame the poor to protect our own fragile belief that our hard work will guarantee our safety.
So how does a natural disaster interact with a psychological shield that strong? If we are so desperate to blame victims, why don't we blame the people whose homes are destroyed by a hurricane?
Because of the sheer undeniable scale of the event.
It's just too big.
Catastrophic tragedies are so visually overwhelming, so vast, and so entirely indiscriminate that they completely shatter the just world rationalization.
Right. I guess you cannot logically look at a 500-mile stretch of coastline entirely leveled by a tsunami and convince yourself, well, all 200,000 of those men, women, and children must have had poor moral character.
Exactly. The math of victim blaming just breaks down. The event is too big to write off as a personal failing.
The scale forces the observer to temporarily abandon the defense.
You are forced to accept, for a brief window, that terrible things happen to innocent people. And when that defense mechanism collapses when the lock is picked, you get a sudden, uninhibited release of sympathy, empathy, and material aid. The threshold is breached.
Okay, we have covered the evolutionary hardware of the Pleistocene and the psychological software of attribution and the just world fallacy. But humans aren't just biological machines running code in a vacuum.
We live in societies. We tell stories.
Exactly. How do we culturally program this threshold into our children over generations?
Culture is the mechanism that reinforces and codifies these cognitive thresholds. It gives us the vocabulary to justify our biases.
Like what?
Let's look at language. The just world fallacy is baked right into our everyday idioms and proverbs across almost every global culture.
Give me some examples. What do we say?
Think about the phrases we use without a second thought. What goes around comes around. He made his bed, now he has to lie in it. You reap what you sow.
Ah, yeah.
Or consider the colloquial, highly westernized interpretation of the concept of karma, which is often bastardized to imply immediate cosmic retribution for bad behavior.
By giving us those idioms, culture provides us with a socially acceptable vocabulary for victim blaming. It sounds like folk wisdom, but it's really a tool to dismiss suffering without feeling guilty.
Exactly. It allows individuals to observe the suffering of the impoverished and dismiss it with a pithy phrase, entirely bypassing any cognitive dissonance.
It's too easy.
And this goes far beyond casual language. Look at our media, our politics, our literature. We have created powerful, enduring mythological archetypes specifically designed to stigmatize dependency.
The paper specifically calls out modern literary constructs, right? Tropes like the welfare queen, which was heavily popularized in American political rhetoric in the 1970s and 80s.
Or the deadbeat dad, or the Australian term dole bludger.
These aren't just insults, are they?
No, they are potent archetypes. They serve to put a recognizable human face on that ancient evolutionary fear of the free rider. They are modern boogeymen designed to keep the small mind threshold locked shut by convincing the public that the system is full of cheaters.
The paper even brings up poetry to illustrate this point, which I found totally fascinating. There is an analysis of a poem called Obituary by A.K. Ramanujan. How does poetry explain our aversion to helping?
Ramanujan's poem brilliantly captures the awkward, almost clinical reality of grief and social expectation. It lays bare how observers often struggle to process a tragedy.
How so?
While society dictates that we should mourn, the observer's underlying psychology is desperately searching for a rationalization, a reason to assign blame so they can feel safe.
You see this dynamic play out all the time in everyday life, especially with chronic illness, like someone tragically passes away from lung cancer. And often, the very first question out of a listener's mouth isn't a word of sympathy, but a question.
Did they smoke?
Yes.
Did they smoke?
And if the answer is yes, you can almost see the dark, quiet sense of relief wash over the observer. The world remains just. They smoked, they got cancer, I don't smoke, therefore I am safe.
The tragedy is contained within a controllable narrative.
Yes.
But the text also notes that culture isn't just used to enforce these boundaries, it can be weaponized to bypass them. And one of the most effective cultural tools for bypassing the rational filters of blame is music.
Music and the performing arts act as incredible social catalysts. Think about massive global musical events like the Live Aid concerts in the 1980s aimed at Ethiopian famine relief.
Right.
These aren't just fundraisers, they are engines of profound emotional contagion.
Because music doesn't argue with your logic. It hits you straight in the emotional center. It leverages universal, nonverbal resonance. A massive disaster relief concert synthesizes what sociologists call communitas. Communitas is an intense, elevated feeling of shared humanity and social equality. By utilizing melody, rhythm, and communal singing, these events bypass the rationalized, linguistic filters of the just world fallacy.
So the music kind of tricks the brain into opening up.
For a few hours, the concert momentarily unites the in-group and the out-group, dissolving the small mind threshold completely and opening the floodgates for donations.
So we've talked about how disasters should trigger this release of compassion, but history is full of dark exceptions.
Oh, absolutely.
I want to spend some time on Section 3 of the source material because it provides a staggering, real-world historical case study of what happens when a government absolutely refuses to let go of the small mind threshold, even in the face of an undeniable catastrophe.
The Scottish Highland potato famine.
Yes, we need to talk about the Scottish Highland potato famine of 1846. Set the scene for us.
The year is 1846. A devastating biological blight, caused by a water mold, completely destroys the potato crop across the Scottish Highlands and the Hebrides.
Just wiped it out entirely.
Yes. Much like the concurrent famine in Ireland, this potato crop was the absolute foundational food source for hundreds of thousands of people. The destruction was total. Mass, widespread starvation was imminent.
Now, based on everything we've just discussed about the hypothesis, this is an undeniable natural disaster.
It is.
A crop blight is a low-control, external, unstable event. It is literally an act of God. So the cognitive skeleton key should turn, the threshold should open, and the British government should unleash massive unconditional aid.
Right. That is what the psychological models predict.
Yeah.
But that is absolutely not what happened.
What went wrong?
The British government's relief effort was primarily guided by a senior Treasury official named Sir Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan and the institutional apparatus of the time were utterly consumed by an ideological terror of the free rider.
They were still worried about free riders during a famine.
They were possessed by the pervasive fear that unconditional charity would irrevocably corrupt the work ethic of the peasantry.
So, staring down the barrel of mass starvation and death, their primary concern was that people might get a little too comfortable taking a handout.
It sounds absurd to modern ears, but it was their governing philosophy. Trevelyan actually wrote letters explicitly stating his fear that institutional dependency would degenerate the population, turning relief efforts into a lazy day hammock that would threaten the moral fabric and productivity of the labor force.
The phrase lazy day hammock while people are literally starving to death in fields is just astounding. So, how did they implement relief without creating this imaginary hammock?
To circumvent this perceived threat of enabling laziness, the government instituted a draconian system based around something called the destitution test.
What was the test?
They were willing to provide food, but they deliberately made the rations incredibly meager. We are talking about an allowance of merely 24 ounces of oatmeal per day for an adult man and half of that amount for a woman.
Barely enough calories to keep a resting body alive.
But they didn't just hand out the oatmeal. There was a catch.
A brutal catch, I imagine.
To receive those 24 ounces of oatmeal, the starving individual had to pass the destitution test by performing a full 8-hour day of grueling, back-breaking manual labor.
You're kidding!
They were organized into work gangs and forced to build what became known as destitution roads.
What is a destitution road? Were they building necessary infrastructure, at least?
In many cases, no. These were often infrastructure projects of highly dubious utility. Some of these roads literally went nowhere, ending abruptly in the middle of a moor.
So what was the point?
The entire point of the labor wasn't to improve the Scottish Highlands. The labor itself was the point. It was a punitive measure designed to ensure the victims didn't receive something for nothing.
It was a physical test of their deservingness.
Yes, a way to absolutely guarantee to the Treasury that these starving people weren't free riding.
That is just horrifying. It is the equivalent of making a man dying of thirst run a marathon just to prove he is thirsty enough to deserve a glass of water.
It really is.
And society allowed this. What was the media saying at the time?
The media aggressively supported and enabled it. Popular literature and the lowland Scottish newspapers routinely published vicious, prejudiced narratives against the Highlanders.
They didn't talk about the crop blight.
They largely ignored the biological failure of the potato crop. Instead, they placed the blame squarely on what they call the intense and abominable idleness of the Gaelic people.
They blamed a plant fungus on the laziness of the farmers.
They circulated pamphlets demanding that the Highlanders be denounced for their indolent habits. The rhetoric explicitly threatened that unless the Highlanders demonstrated a willingness to work harder, they could not expect to be compassionated or relieved by the state.
I have to stop you there because this feels like a major contradiction to the core hypothesis.
How so?
Well, if a natural disaster is supposed to be this magical cognitive skeleton key that automatically opens the threshold, why did it fail so catastrophically in 1846? How was a biological blight successfully reframed as a moral failing of the victims?
It is a critical caveat to the entire theory. The hypothesis states that tragedy liberates compassion unless the observer can successfully reframe the event to maintain their just world defense.
So they found a way around the skeleton key.
In the case of the Highland famine, extreme, deeply entrenched ethnic prejudice, religious differences, and centuries of cultural animosity provided a psychological anchor that was far stronger than the obvious reality of the disaster.
The bias was stronger than the evidence.
Exactly. The Lowland Scots and the British authorities were already so culturally primed to view the Gaelic Highlanders as racially inferior, primitive, and inherently lazy that they simply forced the natural disaster to fit their pre-existing narrative.
They just bent reality to fit their worldview.
The blight was seen as a divine judgment on a lazy people. It proves a dark reality. If systemic prejudice is strong enough, the cognitive threshold remains firmly padlocked, and victims are forced to physically perform their suffering to prove their worth.
That is a sobering historical reality check.
Yeah.
Okay, we've seen what happens when prejudice keeps the door bolted shut.
Right.
Now, let's pivot and look at what actually happens in the streets when an undeniable tragedy does successfully blow the threshold wide open. Let's move into the sociology of disaster. When a massive crisis hits a modern city, what is the reality on the ground?
The very first thing we have to do when discussing disaster sociology is debunk the pervasive Hollywood myth.
The panic and the looting.
Yeah, if you watch almost any disaster movie, whether it's an earthquake, a pandemic, or an alien invasion, the narrative trope is almost always the same.
Society collapses.
The disaster strikes, and within hours, civilized society completely collapses into a Hobbesian nightmare of panic, widespread looting, violent cruelty, and every man for himself savagery.
It makes for incredibly tense cinema. But you're saying the actual sociology doesn't back that up.
Decades of rigorous disaster sociology research categorically debunks that myth. It is a fiction.
So what really happens?
In reality, extreme adversity routinely triggers the exact opposite response. It triggers what sociologists call catastrophe compassion.
Catastrophe compassion.
Instead of widespread panic and violence, the immediate aftermath of a disaster is characterized by elevated pro-social behavior, remarkable altruism, and profound spontaneous cooperation among strangers.
What is actually happening in the psychology of a crowd in those moments? The text uses a couple of specific terms, identity fusion and communitas. How do those manifest in the rubble?
Think about the normal structure of society. We are separated by rigid social hierarchies, political divisions, economic class, racial barriers, neighborhood borders.
Right, all the normal lines that divide us.
But in the immediate chaotic aftermath of a major disaster, the overwhelming primacy of basic survival abruptly erases those boundaries. Survivors experience identity fusion.
Identity fusion. Meaning, I am no longer just a wealthy banker or a struggling waitress. I am simply a survivor, just like you.
Exactly. It is a deep, immediate sense of shared fate forged in the crucible of trauma. This fusion generates communitas, an elevated, almost transcendent social state where people recognize they are unequivocally in this together. The usual rules of social engagement are suspended.
Because the locus of control is entirely externalized.
That's the key. The disaster is universally recognized as an act of God. Nobody can be blamed for an earthquake.
So the brain doesn't have to stand for free riders.
Because there is no blame to assign, the cognitive burden of evaluating deservingness vanishes completely. The threat detection algorithm shuts down. Because of this, individuals will freely risk their own lives, share their fiercely limited food and water supplies, and provide profound emotional support to complete strangers without ever calculating reciprocity.
The paper brings up Hurricane Katrina as a prime example of this phenomenon in action.
Katrina is a perfect example of communitas in action. Obviously, the official institutional response had massive, well-documented failures. But look at the civilian response.
What did the civilians do?
Following the breach of the levees, you didn't just see official Coast Guard rescue operations. You saw an armada of uncoordinated, ordinary citizens rushing toward the danger.
The famous Cajun Navy and thousands of others?
Yes. People from across the region brought their own flat-bottom boats, hitched them to their trucks, and drove into a disaster zone. They risked toxic floodwaters, submerged hazards, and personal injury to pull residents from rooftops.
Unbelievable bravery.
And they did it out of a pure, unadulterated sense of shared humanity. They fundamentally overrode normal psychological inhibitions, ignored bureaucratic red tape, and expended massive amounts of personal effort to save people they had never met and would likely never see again.
It is the purest, most beautiful expression of the liberated urge to help. It's the skeleton key opening the door completely.
It really is.
But there is a catch. The paper makes it clear that this liberation, this communitas, isn't a permanent state of being.
No, it is highly transient. Sociologists refer to this period of extreme widespread altruism as the honeymoon phase of disaster recovery.
The honeymoon phase.
And its temporary nature actually confirms our underlying premise. The small mind threshold, that baseline suspicion and fear of the free rider, is the default operating system of human psychology. Communitas is an emergency override, and emergency overrides are inherently temporary.
So what happens when the honeymoon phase ends? What triggers the shift back to normal?
The shift happens as the immediate existential threat subsides. As the floodwaters recede, the immediate trauma fades, and the arduous, highly bureaucratic task of long-term rebuilding begins.
The adrenaline wears off.
The environment ceases to be a zone of unambiguous external trauma. Suddenly, survival is no longer the issue. Resource allocation is the issue.
And when resources are limited and need to be distributed, things get political.
Highly political. Once the crisis normalizes into a situation of chronic, long-term hardship rebuilding homes, filing insurance claims, seeking FEMA assistance, the environment starts to look a lot like everyday poverty.
I see where this is going.
And when that happens, the deservingness heuristic reactivates.
The ancient caveman hardware boots back up, the threat detector comes back online.
Exactly. Authorities and fellow citizens begin to analyze the survivors through a critical lens again. The questions change. Instead of how many people can we pull from the water, the questions become who truly deserves these reconstruction funds?
Why didn't they have adequate flood insurance before the storm?
Are they exploiting the FEMA relief system to get a better house? The liberation of communities fades, the just world bias returns in full force, and the evolutionary fear of enabling laziness reasserts itself. The blame returns.
It's a sobering cycle. It makes me wonder, when we look in the mirror as a species, which one is the real us? Are we the hero risking our life to pull a stranger onto a boat? Or are we the cynic auditing a FEMA claim and judging a victim 6 months later?
From an evolutionary and psychological standpoint, they are both the real us. We contain multitudes.
Yeah.
The hero is the emergency override designed to save the tribe in a crisis. The cynic is the baseline operating system designed to conserve precious resources when the crisis is over.
Which perfectly transitions us to the next major dimension of this text. Because this psychological roller coaster from hero to cynic doesn't just affect our personal feelings.
No, it has massive financial implications.
It dictates the flow of billions of dollars in global philanthropy and government aid. Let's dig into the behavioral economics of giving.
The financial data provides a vivid, quantifiable map of this psychological dichotomy between everyday poverty and sudden catastrophe. The numbers don't lie.
What do the numbers say?
The public is significantly more likely to open their wallets and contribute substantial financial aid when a crisis is framed as the result of a sudden natural disaster, as opposed to human activity, systemic economic inequality, or long-term armed conflict.
From an economic psychology standpoint, why is that? I mean, a starving person needs a dollar just as badly, whether they are starving because of a hurricane or starving because of systemic generational poverty.
It comes down to two concepts in behavioral economics: efficacy and proximity framing. Donors, whether they realize it or not, are highly sensitive to the perceived impact of their money.
How does that play out with chronic poverty?
When a charity appeals for funds to fight long-term systemic poverty, donors frequently experience what economists call donor fatigue.
Because the problem feels too big.
Exactly. The donation feels like a mere drop in the ocean. The systemic issue of poverty feels like a bottomless pit.
And where does the psychology come back in?
Because the problem feels unsolvable, it triggers cognitive dissonance. To resolve that dissonance, the donor's just world defense activates, causing them to subconsciously assume the poor simply won't work hard enough to fix their own problems.
So they justify keeping their money.
This rationalization allows the donor to comfortably withhold their funds without feeling guilty.
It's like we treat systemic poverty as a bottomless wishing well. We throw a penny in, we hear it echo, we never see a result, and eventually we just stop throwing pennies.
That's a great analogy.
But disaster relief is framed completely differently to the donor.
Entirely differently. Disaster relief appeals utilize concrete vividness. They don't ask you to solve poverty. They provide a highly specific, clear, and achievable goal.
Like what?
The messaging is, your $50 donation will buy a literal tent for a displaced family, or this $100 buys a medical kit that saves a life today.
It's transactional in a satisfying way. It's like a vending machine. We want to clearly see the life raft drop when we put our dollar in the slot.
It promises a concrete, one-time restoration of a survival baseline. Crucially, the donor is assured that this is an acute emergency intervention.
It's a one-and-done deal.
It is not an ongoing financial subsidy, which appeases that deep-seated evolutionary fear that their money might breed intergenerational dependency.
The source material also breaks down the demographics of who gives and why, which adds a whole new layer of complexity to this. And just a quick note to you listening, as we walk through these demographic breakdowns, it's important to remember these are statistical generalizations based purely on the study's aggregate data.
We are impartially reporting the findings of the text here, just exploring the numbers.
Absolutely. So let's look at the broad statistical trends because the nuances are incredibly revealing. Let's start by looking at Generation Z.
The data shows that while Gen Z individuals typically have lower average incomes and less accumulated wealth, they exhibit very high participation rates in philanthropy.
How does that map onto our hypothesis?
The hypothesis suggests that Gen Z has a significantly lower baseline threshold for helping. Statistically, they are more willing to actively challenge the traditional just world paradigm.
So they see the structural issues more clearly.
They demonstrate a higher capacity to recognize and validate systemic inequity, meaning they are more likely to donate to structural, everyday poverty initiatives alongside traditional direct disaster relief.
Now contrast that with the data on the silent generation.
The silent generation represents a fascinating contrast. Statistically, they boast the highest average total monetary donations per individual. They are incredibly generous.
But they give differently.
However, their giving patterns indicate they demand exceptionally clear demonstrations of efficacy and impact. They possess a much higher threshold for donating to everyday poverty.
Why the higher threshold?
Their giving behavior suggests a more deeply ingrained fear of enabling dependency. They require high efficacy, the vending machine model, to circumvent that fear.
They want to know exactly what their money is doing.
Yes, and they prefer interventions that fix an acute problem rather than subsidizing a chronic one.
Let's look at income disparities. How do ultra-high income earners navigate this threshold compared to lower income earners?
High-income earners, we're talking about households earning over $10 million annually, provide the vast, overwhelming majority of total philanthropic dollars in sheer volume.
That makes sense.
For example, the data points to them contributing roughly $5.8 billion in 2020, specifically for disaster relief.
That is a staggering amount of capital.
It is. They are highly responsive to large-scale, undeniable disasters where the question of systemic blame is entirely neutralized by a hurricane or an earthquake.
But there's a paradox, right?
Yet paradoxically, statistical trends show they often resist, through political or social mechanisms, redistributive taxation frameworks that are designed to address the chronic, everyday poverty that exists below the threshold.
And what about the other end of the economic spectrum, lower income earners?
This is perhaps the most poignant data point. Households earning under $50,000 a year donate the highest share of their income to charity, averaging around 14.2%.
14.2% of a sub-$50 income is an incredible sacrifice. Why are they giving a higher percentage?
The hypothesis links this directly to the just world fallacy. For lower income earners, their own daily lived experience with systemic hardship prevents the just world illusion from fully crystallizing.
Because they live it.
They intimately, personally understand that bad things routinely happen to very hardworking people. Because their illusion of a perfectly fair world is already broken by reality, their threshold for compassion is naturally lower.
They don't need a hurricane to prove to them that someone might need help through no fault of their own.
Exactly.
The money really tells the entire psychological story. The capital to solve so many problems is there, but it is locked firmly behind this perception of culpability and control.
It's all about how the problem is framed.
To fully unpack the depths of this, we have to look at the final and arguably most complex piece of the puzzle. We have to look at the intersectional dimensions.
Religion and gender.
Yes, we are going to examine two massive cultural lenses that heavily distort, bend, and warp our altruism threshold. Let's start with the religious paradigms.
In Western contexts, this dynamic is largely defined by a profound, centuries-old historical friction. It is the tension between the Protestant work ethic and the foundational biblical imperative for unconditional charity.
The paper brings up Max Weber here, right?
The text leans heavily on the sociological framework established by Max Weber, who famously analyzed the Protestant work ethic.
Walk us through Weber's core concept, because it still dictates so much of modern economic thought.
Weber argued that certain Protestant traditions conceptualize hard work, frugality, and consequent economic success not just as practical, worldly matters, but as literal outward signs of divine favor and moral grace.
Meaning, if you are wealthy, it isn't just because you're a good businessman, it's because God favors you.
Yeah.
Wealth equals moral virtue.
Exactly. And the dark corollary to that belief is that poverty is therefore stigmatized not just as an economic failure or a run of bad luck, but as a profound spiritual deficit, a lack of grace.
So how does that affect welfare?
Within this paradigm, relying on public charity or welfare carries a deep existential stigma. It enforces a very rigid psychological threshold against helping the poor, based on the deeply held moral fear that providing excessive relief disrupts personal industry, removes the incentive to work, and creates multi-generational spiritual dependency.
And again, remaining entirely impartial and just outlining the text's analysis here, how did this specific religious paradigm react when a massive disaster like Hurricane Katrina struck? Did the threshold open?
Katrina served as a massive sociological stress test for these paradigms. According to the paper's analysis, a small but vocal minority of fundamentalist figures actually utilized the just world fallacy to an extreme, almost medieval degree.
What did they do?
They attempted to reframe the hurricane, an obvious natural disaster, as an intentional act of God designed to explicitly punish a wicked, sinful city.
By doing that, they managed to keep their compassion threshold closed. They shifted the blame back to the victim's perceived moral failings, even in the face of a flood.
Yes, it is a stark example of the just world defense mechanism working in overdrive. However, the text makes it abundantly clear that this was not the majority response. Not at all.
How did the majority of faith-based communities respond?
The overwhelming majority of faith-based organizations and religious charities were completely liberated by the disaster. They bypassed the threshold entirely.
They mobilized.
They mobilized with incredible speed, providing an estimated 14 million hours of volunteer service post-Katrina. For these groups, the sheer, undeniable scale of the tragedy completely eclipsed any lingering ideological anxieties over enabling dependency.
The emergency override kicked in.
Powerfully. And interestingly, the disaster actually catalyzed a massive paradigm shift for many of these groups.
Well, so.
They moved from a model of simple private charity, just handing out blankets and food, to a model of structural justice. They began advocating for policies that would rebuild neighborhoods and empower victims long term. The disaster liberated them to focus on unconditional, systemic relief.
That brings us to the final, and perhaps most structurally complex, lens analyzed in the text. Gender.
This part is fascinating.
The paper reveals something it calls a deservingness premium. Walk us through this paradox, because honestly, reading this part blew my mind.
It is a profound, deeply systemic paradox that reveals how biased our heuristics really are. Consider the reality of everyday economics and the evaluation of everyday welfare and labor. Women generally face well-documented systemic economic devaluation.
They face wage gaps, the burden of unpaid domestic labor, career penalties for motherhood.
Society economically penalizes them. Yet, extensive experimental research and sociological data show that when applying for public aid or welfare, women paradoxically receive a deservingness premium.
Let me make sure I'm understanding this clearly. You are saying that evaluators, whether they are government workers or just the general public voting on a policy, are statistically more likely to grant welfare to a woman than they are to a man who has the exact same economic qualifications and hardships.
Yes, exactly.
Why?
To understand why, we have to look back at the control criterion of the NICER model. Our threat detection algorithm judges people based on how much macroeconomic agency they possess.
Okay, so how does society view women's agency?
Historically, society stereotypically views women as having less macroeconomic agency, less power, and less control over their external financial circumstances compared to men.
Because the patriarchal expectation is that men are supposed to be the masters of their economic domain.
Exactly, because men are historically, traditionally, and culturally expected to be autonomous, highly capable breadwinners. A male seeking everyday welfare is harshly penalized by the observer's brain.
His poverty isn't seen as bad luck.
No, his poverty is viewed as a catastrophic failure of his inherent expected agency. This instantly triggers the evolutionary suspicion of laziness.
The paper calls this the home slacker trope, the idea that a poor man is just refusing to do his biological duty to hunt the mammoth.
Precisely. But because societal sexism views women as more inherently vulnerable or helpless in the brutal macroeconomic sphere, the evaluator's fear of enabling laziness isn't triggered as aggressively.
The observer's brain says, well, she has less control over this, so it's not entirely her fault.
Thus, the cognitive threshold to help a woman experiencing everyday poverty is inherently structurally lower than it is for a man.
But the paper includes a crucial, devastating caveat to this so-called premium. It isn't a universal benefit.
It absolutely is not. The text emphasizes that this deservingness premium is strictly intersectional. It frequently vanishes entirely for minority women.
Why does it vanish?
This erasure is due to the intrusion of highly racialized, weaponized political tropes.
Like the welfare queen narrative we discussed earlier, which was specifically engineered to racialize poverty in the minds of voters.
Yes. When minority status intersects with gender, the virulent cultural prejudice of those tropes overrides the gender premium entirely. The evaluator's brain bypasses the assumption of vulnerability and defaults straight to the suspicion of cheating.
It's just layer upon layer of bias.
It reveals just how deeply biased, malleable, and ultimately fragile this cognitive threshold truly is. It is manipulated by cultural narratives.
That is a wild, tragic irony. You are saying that the pervasive societal sexism that views women as helpless actually accidentally benefits them when applying for life-saving welfare, but only if they happen to fit the racial demographic majority.
Sadly, yes.
That proves this has nothing to do with objective morality. It's all just cultural programming overlaying primitive hardware.
It is a stark, undeniable example of how inconsistent and prejudiced our application of compassion really is. And it's important to note that these gender dynamics don't just apply to how we judge the victims, they also heavily dictate how men and women behave as donors and helpers.
Let's look at that side of the equation. How does gender affect the helper's mindset? This relates back to the belief in a just world, or BJW, right?
Yes. Extensive meta-analytic reviews of psychological data indicate that, on average, men consistently score significantly higher on measures of belief in a just world than women do.
Why do men believe the world is fairer?
It correlates with power dynamics. Because women, statistically, experience much higher rates of systemic injustice, physical vulnerability, and economic penalty, their belief in a perfectly fair, predictable world is frequently disrupted by their own lived reality.
They know the world isn't always just because it hasn't always been just to them.
So what does that mean for how men and women actually dispense help in the real world?
Yeah, how does it play out?
Because women generally possess weaker, just world beliefs, they naturally possess a lower baseline threshold for compassion. They're less likely to assume a poor person deserves their poverty.
So they give more readily.
Consequently, they're statistically more prone to engage in everyday, non-emergency, pro-social helping, volunteering at a food bank, checking on a neighbor, organizing community support.
And men.
Men, possessing a much stronger just world defense mechanism, believing that the system generally works fairly, usually require a massive, undeniable external shock to bypass their threshold.
They need the hurricane.
They need the disaster to prove that the suffering is unearned.
But when that massive disaster finally hits...
When it hits, the data shows men are highly responsive. The unambiguous emergency completely suspends the male just world evaluation, allowing for rapid, courageous, heroic rescue efforts.
This is where you see the testosterone-mediated high-risk interventions, rushing into a burning building, navigating floodwaters.
The emergency override unleashes the hero.
It does. But true to the cycle of communitas, once the emergency normalizes, the heroic imperative fades. The pervasive baseline aversion to enabling laziness reasserts itself, and the threshold closes once again.
The cycle starts all over.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have traveled from the caloric mathematics of the African savannah to the psychological torture labs of the 1960s, to the brutal roads of the Scottish Highlands, and into the floodwaters of the Gulf Coast. Let's try to synthesize this incredible journey for everyone listening. What is the ultimate takeaway?
The overarching takeaway of this entire synthesis is this. The small mind threshold, that instinct to judge the poor and withhold help, is not simply a symptom of modern political polarization, nor is it necessarily a sign of inherent individual meanness.
It's deeper than that.
It is an ancient, deeply embedded evolutionary survival tool. It was built over millennia to protect our ancestors from fatal free riders. Today, that obsolete hardware is fiercely guarded by powerful cognitive biases, like the just world fallacy, and it is reinforced by centuries of cultural myths and idioms.
It's a fortress built around our empathy. And the only thing that reliably, universally shatters the walls of that fortress is the undeniable, indiscriminate, visually overwhelming nature of a catastrophic tragedy.
The catastrophe is the skeleton key.
Exactly. The disaster momentarily bridges the vast gap between us. It forces us to drop our biases, bypassing our most cynical, resource-guarding instincts. And in doing so, it reveals a deeply cooperative, profoundly empathetic core of human nature that is always there, just waiting for permission to act.
It's an optimistic thought, in a way.
It is a beautiful thought, but honestly, it leaves me with one final, very provocative thought. Something that wasn't explicitly analyzed in the text, but feels incredibly urgent based on everything we have discussed for the last hour.
What is that?
Well, if our ultimate compassion is only unlocked by events that our brains deem entirely external and uncontrollable acts of God, what happens in the near future?
With climate change.
Exactly. As climate change accelerates, extreme weather events are becoming both highly predictable and, arguably, human-caused. Will we eventually lose our catastrophe compassion altogether?
That's a scary thought.
If a hurricane is no longer viewed as an uncontrollable act of God, but the result of human carbon emissions and poor civic planning, will the skeleton key stop working? Will the threshold just stay locked? And will we just start victim-blaming people for choosing to live in hurricane zones or wildfire areas?
That is the terrifying, unresolved question at the heart of this. If a disaster loses its psychological status as an unpredictable act of God and becomes just another predictable hazard, we may find ourselves facing the next century's crises without a skeleton key at all. The threshold might just become permanent.
And suddenly, that X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning, the one we use to look for a clean, clear picture of human empathy, is just showing us muddy, turbulent waters all the way down.
It's a complex, challenging landscape,
Yeah,
and it is one we all need to navigate with a lot more self-awareness about the biases running silently in our own minds.
absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep exploration. If you found this breakdown valuable, if it made you think differently about how and why we help each other, please make sure to subscribe and share this with someone who loves falling down a complex rabbit hole just as much as we do. We'll catch you next time right here on Today in the Hypothesis.